the Hollywood Unapologetic Podcast with Orlando Delbert, Filmmaking Essentials.
Great to be here.
Today, we're jumping straight into something pretty fascinating, I think. It's this collision point, right? Where popular culture, specifically film, kind of slams into world politics.
Yeah, it's not something you always think about together, is it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how movies don't just, reflect what's going on globally, but can actually shape how we see other countries.
And sometimes even cause, actual government reactions, real-world stuff.
Right.
And we've got some really interesting sources lined up for this. We're looking at academic work on film and international relations, a list of politically important movies, a philosophical take on satire in film.
Satire. Always interesting.
Definitely. Plus, a study on Hollywood ideology during the Reagan years, something on televised war.
Wow.
And even a Reddit thread talking about pessimism in movies. So, a real mix.
Yeah. Okay. Quite the range. So, our mission, it's basically to unpack how film has gotten tangled up with politics. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes totally by accident.
And looking at the real consequences, right? The things that actually happened because of a movie.
Exactly. So let's get into it. This idea first that these worlds aren't really separate.
Yeah, they're more like on a continuum.
Yeah.
And a really powerful example, probably the clearest one recently, is the whole saga around The Interview.
The Interview, yeah. 2014. The comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un.
That's the one.
That definitely caused some waves, didn't it?
Waves is putting it mildly. I mean, just announcing the film made relations between the U.S. and North Korea worse.
Just the announcement.
Yep. But then it got really serious. Sony Pictures, the studio, got hit with this massive cyber attack right before the release.
I remember that. And the U.S. blamed North Korea.
They did.
Yeah.
U.S. officials pointed the finger pretty directly at Pyongyang, although North Korea denied it consistently. But that whole thing, it just showed this new kind of vulnerability, using pop culture and cyber attacks to mess with geopolitics completely outside the usual diplomatic playbook.
And it wasn't just the cyber attack, was it?
Yeah.
There were actual threats.
Oh, yeah. Really serious ones. Terrorist threats against American moviegoers.
Wow.
People got worried about Japanese citizens who'd been abducted by North Korea years ago. And then there were calls for China to step in, try and control hackers maybe operating there.
So it spiraled way beyond just the movie itself.
Massively. And look, Hollywood films have angered foreign governments before. That's not new. But The Interview, it's probably the most controversial piece of pop culture in a long time to have such a direct, measurable impact on world politics.
It's a pretty stark example of fiction having very real friction with reality. Makes you think about other times Hollywood might have, stepped on political toes.
Oh, absolutely. There's a long history there. Plenty of films have provoked official condemnation, popular backlash.
Like, what are some older examples?
Well, the sources point to a few. Think about Chaplin's The Great Dictator back in 1940.
Right, taking on Hitler and Mussolini.
Exactly, when tensions were already sky high. Or from Russia with Love, the Bond film, right in the Cold War.
Classic Cold War stuff.
Yeah, and then something like Cry Freedom in '87 about apartheid in South Africa. Those all angered governments that were, enemies or adversaries of the U.S. at the time.
Okay, that makes sense. Films criticizing regimes the U.S. opposed. But what about friendly countries? Has they gotten upset too?
That's where it gets maybe even more interesting. Because yes, definitely. Even allies. Remember Hostel?
The horror movie.
Vaguely. Well, people in Slovakia were really, really unhappy with how their country was portrayed, like this haven for torture and violence.
Ouch.
And then there's Borat. Kazakhstan was, let's just say, not amused by Sacha Baron Cohen's portrayal.
Oh yeah, I definitely remember the Borat controversy. So it's not just about enemies, it's about representation, even with friends.
Exactly. And that really hits on a key point scholars make. Cinema is incredibly powerful in shaping how we see ourselves, our national identity, and also how we see foreign others, especially the enemy other.
Right, like Germans and Japanese during World War II, Soviets in the Cold War.
Islamist terrorists, more recently. Film can really cement those images, those narratives in people's minds.
And the sources also mention this long-standing link between Hollywood and the U.S. military-industrial complex. How does that fit in?
Well, that relationship goes way back, like, to the late 1930s. It's kind of inevitable, maybe, that Hollywood narratives often align, consciously or not, with broader American geopolitical views.
Okay.
With The Interview, that depiction of Kim Jong-un as this sort of cartoonish Asiatic dictator, that's a really obvious example of a kind of xenophobic way of representing someone.
Yeah, pretty blatant.
But often the sources argue it's much more subtle. The way the other is presented isn't always over-the-top villainy.
How so? Like, what are some subtle examples?
Well, one scholar, Keith Booker, talks about things like Orientalism or anti-German feelings, even Russophobia popping up in classic Disney cartoons.
In Disney. Wow.
Yeah. Or think about Cold War sci-fi films, all those alien invasion movies, often seen as metaphors for the fear of communism, right? Portraying Russians or Eastern Europeans negatively.
Right, the hidden messages.
Exactly. Even James Bond films over decades, they sort of teach viewers about the dangers of world politics, framing different groups as threats. And obviously, post 9/11, there was a whole wave of films dealing with the global war on terror. So the link's always there, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet.
It's like these films are building this framework for how we see the world and America's place in it. So how did governments used to react to this stuff? And has that changed?
Historically, yeah, the reactions were pretty straightforward. Often they just banned the film in their country.
Just block it entirely.
Yep. Sometimes because people were calling for boycotts. Or they might issue an official complaint, maybe even aimed at the U.S. or British government, like they were somehow responsible.
Okay. Pretty blunt tools.
But yeah, things have shifted, especially this millennium. Governments are getting a bit more sophisticated, maybe?
How so? Not just bans anymore.
Right. They're using different tactics now, what some call quasi-diplomacy.
Quasi-diplomacy.
Yeah, like negotiating directly with the public internationally or with the big media corporations or other players trying to soften negative portrayals or manage the fallout.
That makes sense. In today's world, everything's so connected. So back to The Interview. How did that play out with this new approach?
Well, North Korea actually tried the old way first. They went to the UN, the White House, trying to stop the film. Didn't really work. They were mostly ignored. And that's when things went off the rails, you know? The cyber attack on Sony and then that really scary 9/11 style threat against moviegoers.
Which led to Sony pulling the plug on the theatrical release, right?
Yeah.
That felt huge at the time.
It was massive. The big cinema chains backed out because of the threats, safety concerns.
Understandably.
Yeah. And Sony basically canceled the wide release. Then, almost immediately, U.S. officials were on TV saying Pyongyang was behind the cyber attack.
And the reaction inside the U.S. was pretty intense, too, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. You could feel it was a big moment. Some small theaters tried to show Team America, World Police in protests.
Right. The puppet movie that also made fun of Kim Jong-il.
Yeah. But Paramount, the studio that made Team America, actually stopped them. Probably worried about more attacks or something.
Interesting.
And another film project, one starring Steve Carell, set in North Korea, called Pyongyang, got canceled right after all this blew up.
Wow. And didn't some big political names weigh in pretty heavily?
They sure did. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, he actually said America had lost its first cyber war. Pretty strong statement.
Yeah, framing it as a major defeat.
And President Obama spent a good chunk of his end-of-year press conference talking about it. He called Sony's decision to pull the film a mistake.
A mistake. Why?
He worried about the precedent it set, you know, like letting dictators censor things in the U.S., bad for free speech, globally too. He even promised the U.S. would respond proportionally to the attack.
And it pushed cybersecurity right to the front of the conversation, didn't it?
Absolutely. Obama linked it directly to meeting international rules for cybersecurity. Said he was talking to Japan, China, South Korea, Russia about it.
So a comedy film ends up prompting high-level international talks on cyber warfare?
Pretty much. And behind the scenes, you had U.S. officials whispering to reporters, worried that maybe China or Russia had helped the North Korean hackers. Even the Homeland Security Secretary, Jed Johnson, said it wasn't just an attack on Sony, but on, like, freedom of expression, the American way of life. Big stuff.
It just really drives home how pop culture, even a silly comedy, can suddenly become this major international flashpoint, touching on free speech, cyber war, involving multiple big countries.
Exactly. And, you know, international relations scholars used to be maybe a bit dismissive of pop culture's impact, focusing on armies and treaties.
Right. The serious stuff.
Yeah. But there's this growing realization now, like here Bourdieu said, when one is speaking of popular culture, one is speaking about politics. There's even a whole field now called popular geopolitics looking at exactly these links. And the interview incident, it basically proved that pop culture's impact isn't just theory, it's measurable. It has real consequences.
So yeah, a comedy triggers actual geopolitical fallout. Kind of blows your mind.
It really does. Yeah. And the whole thing kind of put American identity, Western identity on display, reinforced those good versus evil, freedom versus repression ideas.
Right.
And Sony's reaction, pulling the film, it created this really charged atmosphere, almost like post 9/11, where freedom felt like it was under attack.
And Sony lost a lot of money, obviously.
Yeah. Huge financial hit. Plus, there are worries, that this could be used as an excuse to push for more internet restrictions, more surveillance, all in the name of security.
Which raises some pretty big questions about what comes next, doesn't it? Yeah. Like, will other countries that don't like how they're shown in Western media try similar tactics? Cyber attacks, pressure campaigns?
That's exactly the fear. What if Russia or China get more aggressive about how they're depicted?
Or even countries like Brazil or India. Could they start using these kinds of methods to control their image?
These are the tricky questions people are wrestling with now. The interview really showed how pop culture could become this new battleground for international conflict. Very volatile.
It's a serious reminder that screen life can have major real-life consequences in global politics. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Some of our sources talked about film not just reflecting political feelings, but maybe even driving political pessimism.
Yeah, that came up in the Lifehacker list and that Reddit thread about why maybe we don't see as many super downbeat political films now compared to, say, the 1970s.
The 70s. Yeah, that era seemed full of political paranoia in movies.
Oh, totally. Films like 7 Days in May, The Conversation, The Parallax View, even Dr. Strangelove with its dark satire, and of course, All the President's Men, Z, they all had this deep mistrust of government, of institutions.
Well, you had Watergate happening, Vietnam winding down badly, assassinations.
Yeah.
It was a rough time.
Definitely a time of huge social and political anxiety, and it really seeped into the films. That Lifehacker list even mentioned A Face in the Cloud as being spookily predictive about a certain kind of populist leader.
Right. And there were others tackling government corruption directly, like Enemy of the State or 3 Days of the Condor.
Yeah, and even based on truth films like Miss Ever's Boys about the Tuskegee experiment showing real government wrongdoing.
It wasn't just dramas, right? Even genre stuff.
Exactly, like Captain America, The Winter Soldier, The X-Files movie, Cabin in the Woods. They all play with those themes of government conspiracy, hidden agendas, just in different ways.
So why the shift? Why maybe fewer of those films now, according to the sources?
Well, the Reddit discussion had some interesting ideas. One was about the early 70s movie attendance was actually down then.
Really?
Yeah. Studios were struggling a bit, maybe more willing to take risks on cheaper counterculture films aimed at younger adults who were still going to the cinema. Think Easy Rider, The Graduate.
So desperation breeds creativity, kind of?
Maybe. But then came the blockbusters. Jaws, then Star Wars. Suddenly, huge profits were possible again with big, crowd-pleasing movies.
Ah, the game changed.
Right. The focus shifted back to escapism. True, it didn't disappear completely, but maybe their mainstream reach wasn't quite the same, reflecting that broader shift in taste or studio priorities.
It's fascinating how the mood of the country seems to feed into what gets made and what audiences want to see. Okay, another angle our sources hit on. Film not just reflecting ideology, but actively promoting it. Douglas Kellner's analysis of Reagan-era Hollywood came up.
Yes, Kellner's work is really insightful here. He argues that Hollywood films, especially from the 60s onward, were really tied into the big political and social fights of the time.
Okay.
So 60s films might reflect the anti-war movement, civil rights, but then in the 80s, he sees this clear shift, what he calls the triumph of the right. And Rambo is his prime example.
Rambo, yeah, that character definitely felt like a symbol of that era. How does Kellner break down the ideology in those films?
He sees Rambo as embodying this mix of revolutionary conservatism and sort of radical conservative individualism. The films offer this fantasy return to Vietnam, right? But this time, the lone American hero wins decisively. It's like symbolic compensation for the actual defeat.
Kind of rewriting history through action movies.
Exactly. And the enemies, Vietnamese, Russians, and the sequels, they're just pure evil. These alien others, very black and white, good versus evil, which fits a long Hollywood tradition. Rambo wasn't just reflecting conservatism. Kellner argues it actively boosted this narrative of American might and unilateral action.
And didn't President Reagan himself kind of endorse Rambo?
He absolutely did. Famously said something like watching Rambo gave him ideas about dealing with terrorists.
Right.
Kellner points out how Reagan's actual policies, covert wars, interventions, sometimes seem to echo the Rambo themes. People even called figures like Oliver North Rambos.
That's incredible. A fictional character having that kind of resonance with and maybe even influence on actual policy. But surely there were films pushing back against that view during the 80s.
Oh, for sure. Kellner stresses that it's always a contested space. While films like Rambo were huge and pushed one view, other films were definitely challenging those right-wing ideas about war, communism, offering more liberal or left perspectives.
So it was a monolithic.
No. And Kellner also makes the interesting point that even movies like Red Dawn, which seem really straightforwardly right-wing, can sometimes accidentally show the flaws or absurdities of those extreme positions just by how they portray things.
Right. It shows that even within pop culture, there's this constant back and forth about ideas and how we see the world. Okay, let's talk about satire. Political satire in film as a form of critique. Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 came up.
Yes, drawing on Thomas Wartenberg's analysis. He sees Fahrenheit 9/11 as a really key example of satire used for social and political critique.
The film targeting the Bush administration and the Iraq War. Hugely controversial.
Massively. It got slammed for, lack of journalistic balance, picking and choosing evidence.
But Wartenberg argues the satire itself was effective, that the humor was its strength.
He does. He makes the case that humor, especially satire, can be incredibly powerful for undermining authority, for challenging the official story.
How so?
By using satire, Moore got audiences to look at leaders and events differently, more critically, more skeptically. Wartenberg mentions scenes like politicians preening for cameras, or how Moore framed the 2000 election controversy. He argues that just laughing at power can be a form of resistance. It makes authority seem less scary, less absolute.
So it's not just about facts, it's about using humor and irony to expose things, to make people question the status quo.
Exactly. And Wartenberg notes Moore cleverly mixes this biting humor with more standard documentary stuff, archival footage, interviews.
Right, it wasn't just jokes.
No, it was a blend, aiming to entertain, but also to reveal what Moore saw as the political realities and maybe questionable motives behind U.S. policy after 9/11.
Satire seems like such a potent way to tackle tough political subjects, maybe reaching people who wouldn't watch a dry documentary. Now, something else our sources touched on, how even public broadcasting, which we often think of as neutral, can become a political battleground. The piece on PBS and Watergate.
Yeah, that gavel-to-gavel article, it really shows how the early days of U.S. public broadcasting, the relationship between CPB and PBS were full of tension, especially over who controlled the programming.
And the Nixon administration specifically tried to influence it.
Oh, very deliberately. They had a multi-part strategy. They put people sympathetic to them on the CTB board, tried to cut funding, pressured CPB to sideline PBS figures they saw as left-wingers or critics, like Robert McNeil or Sander Vanneker.
So direct political pressure.
Yep. Nixon speechwriter Pat Buchanan was apparently pretty blunt about wanting to get anti-Nixon programming off the air.
Wow. Trying to control the narrative on public TV. But the article says PBS still managed to cover Watergate extensively.
It did. Despite all that pressure, PBS decided to air the Watergate hearings live, gavel to gavel.
That must have been huge.
It was. It gave this national platform to testimony and information that directly contradicted the administration, helped people understand what was really going on. It's this fascinating clash, the administration trying to control things, and public TV providing this in-depth, independent coverage anyway.
What do you think allowed PBS to do that, despite the pressure?
That's a good question. Maybe the structure designed to have some independence, the commitment of the journalists involved. It definitely highlights why having a free press, even publicly funded, is so vital for accountability.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, the Vietnam War being called the first television war. Why that title, and what was the impact?
It got that name because it had this unprecedented level of TV news coverage right from the battlefields and largely uncensored.
Unlike previous wars.
Right. World War II coverage was heavily censored, very focused on boosting morale, always positive. Vietnam was different. Reporters and cameras had much more freedom to show what they were actually seeing.
And that uncensored, often graphic footage really hit home in the U.S., didn't it?
It had a massive impact on public opinion, especially after things like the Tet Offensive in '68. The news coverage felt much more critical, more negative about the war effort, even if officials were saying things were going well.
So people were seeing the reality in their living rooms.
Every night. The suffering of soldiers, the destruction, the human cost, it was unavoidable. It built empathy, but it also fueled the anti-war movement hugely.
And specific events televised, like the My Lai massacre.
Exactly. Seeing things like that caused widespread outrage, really shifted public opinion, and eventually put pressure on the government that contributed to the decision to withdraw.
So television really transformed how the public engaged with that war, and maybe even affected the outcome.
Undeniably, it showed the immense power of visual media to connect people to distant events and shape their understanding, for good or ill, depending on your view.
Well, this has been quite the exploration, really digging into this tangled relationship between movies, pop culture, and world politics.
It's clear they're not separate worlds at all, are they? They're deeply connected.
Yeah. Films reflect our anxieties, push ideologies, sometimes trigger huge international incidents.
Become battlegrounds for influence. It's complex.
And understanding this continuum, as the sources called it, it really does give you insight into how we see ourselves, how we see others, how stories shape our view of world events.
Absolutely. It changes how you watch things, maybe.
Definitely. So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for everyone listening. In this age of instant global communication, super sophisticated media, how is this power of pop culture going to keep evolving? How will it impact world politics next?
And maybe just as importantly, what role do you play? As someone who consumes media, how do you navigate this complex landscape?
Good questions to chew on. Maybe revisit some of the films we talked about. Think about them through this lens. Thanks for joining us. You can find more insights on navigating the entertainment industry and achieving success in Orlando Delbert's work, including his book, Pollyanna's Tear-Soaked Battlefields of Hollywood, a survival guide against the cynicism and the hypocritical, and of course, the Hollywood Unapologetic platform. And always remember, you are the key to your own success. You are the new Hollywood generation.
Be informed, be prepared, and most importantly, be great.
That's it. Be great. Good luck out there.
See you next time.